We continue now at the top of Daf 60a Daf and Mesechet Sanhedrin. This is Sanhedrin Daf 60a. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought the opinion of Rabbi Shimon that also kishuf, when it comes to witchcraft, that is also one of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. And the Gemara says, what's the source? The Gemara says, because it says in the pasuk mechashefa lo sechaya, it says that a mechashefa, a witch, is not to live. Uchsiv, and it's also written in the pasuk called shochev in behema mos yumas. It says anybody who lies with an animal, bestiality, will surely die. That's the next pasuk. And so we learn a comparison called sheyeshno bechlal kol shochev in behema. Anybody who's included in the prohibition of bestiality, yeshno bechlal mechashefa lo sechaya, is also included in mechashefa, and that's how we know that kishuf is one of the mitzvahs of the b'nei Noach. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Brisa said, Rabbi Elazar says, af al hakilayim, when it comes to b'nei Noach, they're also commanded with regards to kilayim. And the Gemara says, menohani mili, from where do we know this? Amar Shmuel, Amar Kra, Shmuel says it's because the pasuk says, es chukosai tishmoru, it says you'll keep my laws. We understand that to mean chukim shechakakti l'chakvar. It means the laws that have already been in place for the b'nei Noach. Behemtecha lo sarbia kilayim v'sadcha lo sizra kilayim, and it says then your animal you can't have as kilayim, and also your field you can't have as kilayim. It can't be mixtures. Ma behemtecha beharba, just like by animals. What are we talking? We're not talking about plowing with two different kinds of animals. We're talking about mating two different kinds of animals. And af sadcha, so too when it's with the reference to your field. Beharkava, we're talking about grafting specifically. That's what's included in this prohibition. Ma behemtecha, and furthermore, just like your animal bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz, that the prohibition applies whether in Eretz Yisrael or outside of Eretz Yisrael. Afsadcha, so too by your field. When we're discussing the kilayim, bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz, that's whether it's in Eretz Yisrael or whether it's outside of Eretz Yisrael. And Rashi explains as chukosai teshmoru keshehizr Yisrael b'Sinai. What's going on over here is that when Klal Yisrael is being warned at Har Sinai, behemtecha lo sarbia, they're being warned behemtecha lo sarbia about kilayim. That's the same pasuk that's being quoted as chukosai teshmoru. Pasuk bukra as chukosai teshmoru. The pasuk begins with the words as chukosai teshmoru. Mashalo pasuk kein b'shar mekomos. We don't see that in other places. Shma minos. You see from this hachi kamerlu. This is what's being said to them. As chukosai shechakakti kvar livnei Noach teshmoru. Those laws which have already been given to the b'nei Noach, you have to keep. The eluhain, and they are as follows: behemtecha lo sarbia kilayim. You can't have kilayim by your animals, and it means sarbia kilayim. It means to mate the animals. Aval al charisha as chor v'chamor lo hisartim. In terms of plowing with, let's say, an ox and a donkey, that he's not warning them against. And then sadcha lo sizra kilayim. Then also it says you can't plant in your field kilayim. Uzriya zu eina zriya mamish. We're not talking here about planting like two different seeds. To lo nitzdavu b'nei Noach al kilei hakerem. The b'nei Noach are not commanded about kilayim of the vineyard. Elo, rather, shelo laharchiv ilon al she'eno mino. Rather, what it means is you can't graft one tree on a different kind of tree. De lo sizra dumya de lo sarbia. We learn out lo sizra similar to lo sarbia. Ma behema beharba, just like by animals, we're talking again about mating two species. Davar hamesuyim al davar hamesuyim, something that's distinct with something else that's distinct. So that's also true by when it comes to trees. We're talking about something like grafting. Davar mesuyim and davar mesuyim. Ma behema bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, and also just like by an animal, it applies both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. The chovas haguf she'ena tuli b'chovas haaretz nafklan b'kiddushin. The nohages afila b'chutz la'aretz. That's something that's an obligation of the body, so to speak. So it applies even outside of Eretz Yisrael. So too we learn also again when it comes to kilayim, that applies even outside of Eretz Yisrael. But the Gemara continues, but according to that, ushmartem es chukosai ves mishpatai, when it says in the pasuk ushmartem es chukosai, there also, why don't we say the same thing? We should say, when it says chukosai ves mishpatai, chukim shechakakti l'chakvar, should be the laws that I've already given to you. Rashi says, the context of that pasuk is it's written with reference to the whole Torah. Let's say that the entire Torah is really given over to the B'nai Noach as well. And the Gemara says, no, hasam over there, ushmartem es chukosai dehashta. There what it means is that you're going to watch my laws that are right now, but over here, es chukosai tishmoru, when it's phrased as chukosai tishmoru, chukim d'mei kara tishmoru. That sounds like it's saying the laws that were already given. Rashi explains, here the word chukim is before the idea of watching, the command to watch. That already sounds like we're talking about laws that have already been in place. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha v'chula. Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha said, when we're talking about somebody who cursed the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's the defendant. So when the witnesses testify against him, they shouldn't actually use the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As the Mishnah said, they should say Yake Yosi es Yosi. And then only at the very end, when we're ready for a verdict, so then one of the witnesses will actually say exactly what the defendant said. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Rav Acha bar Yaakov says, Eino chayiv ad sheyivorech shem ben arba osios. The person is only chayiv, meaning to say he's only liable to the death penalty when he curses the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the four-letter name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yud Kei Vav Kei. La'afuke ben shtei osios delo. And the Gemara says, what that means to exclude is, let's say, the name that's just two letters, just the Yud and the Hey, that the person would not be liable. The Gemara says, well, Pshita, isn't that obvious? What's Rav Acha bar Yaakov even telling us? Yake Yosi es Yosi Tanan. It says in the Mishnah, Yosi es Yosi. We use the example of Yosi because that has four letters. And the Gemara says, Ma'u D'Tema, what might you have said? Milsa Bi'alma Hu D'Nakat. That's just a mere example. Kamash Malon. So he's teaching us, no, it has to be the four-letter name. And the Gemara continues, Zika Diamri, there are those that have a slightly different version of Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Rav Acha bar Yaakov says, Shema Mino Shem ben Arba Osios Nami Shemhu. You see from the Mishnah that the four-letter name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is also considered the Shem Hashem. Rashi says, Shem ben Arba Osios, Shemhu v'lo b'in Shem HaMeforosh ben Arboim Ushtayim Osios, meaning it's considered the Shem Hashem, and you don't need the Shem HaMeforosh, which is 42 letters. And the Gemara says, again, Pshit, it's obvious what's Rav Acha bar Yaakov telling us. Yake Yosi es Yosi Tanan. The Mishnah says Yosi es Yosi. It's talking about the four-letter name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Gemara says, no, Ma'u D'Tema, what might you have said? Adi'ika Shem Rabba. Maybe you need to have the longer name, the 42-letter name. Umilsa Bi'alma Hu D'Nakan. And again, we're just giving an example. Kamash Malan. So it's coming to teach again that the Shem ben Arba Osios is considered a shame. And the Gemara continues, Nigmar Hadin, again, then when there was the verdict, so then they would have one of the witnesses actually say exactly the curse and say the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and everyone would stand up. And the Gemara says, Omdin Minolan, from where do we know that everyone should stand up when they hear the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Barami, Rabbi Yitzchak Barami says, the Yamar Kra, it's because the Pasuk says, the Ehud Ba'elav, that Ehud came to him, this is by Eglon and Sefer Shoftim, V'hu Yoshe Ba'aliyas HaMekara Asher Lo Levado, he was sitting up in the cool room, that was the upper room, Yomer Ehud, and Ehud said, Dvar Lakimli Eilecha, I have to speak with you, a word of God. Vayakam Eyal Hakisa, he got up, he stood up, and so you see he stands up. And the Gemara says, Vahalo Dvarim Kal V'chomer, and isn't it a Kal V'chomer? Uma Eglon Melech Moav Shu Nachri, if Eglon, the king of Moab, was a non-Jew, V'lo Yada Ela B'Kina, he only knows about Kino, he only knows about the appellations of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Amad, and he stood up. So Yisrael, so when it comes to Klal Yisrael, V'Shem HaMeforish, and we're talking about the Shem HaMeforish, Alachas Kama V'Kama, certainly a person should stand up. And the Gemara continues, Korin Minol, and it said in the Mishnah that they would tear their clothing. From where do we know that? Techsib, because it's written in the Pasuk, Vayavo el Yakim ben Chilkiyo v'shev nasofer v'yoch ben Asov hamazkir el Chizkiyo kirue begadim. It says they came with torn clothing. Vayagidu lo es divrei Rav Shake, and they told him the words of Rav Shake, which was the Rav Shake cursed HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They said over those words, and you see that they had torn clothing. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, lo ma'achen. It says that when the clothing is torn, it's torn in a way where it's never sewn up again. And the Gemara says, Menolan, from where do we know this? Amar Rabbi Avo says, Asya Kriya. That's from a Gzereshava with the word Kriya. Ksiv hacha krue begadim. Again, it says, when it's talking about Rav Shake, it says krue begadim, as we said above. Uchsiv hasam, and it's written over there, Ve'elisha roeh, v'hu mitzaik avi rechev Yisrael farashav, v'lo ra'o od vayechzek bevegadav vayikroim l'shnayim karoim. It says he tore into two tears. Mimashma shenemar vayikroim l'shnayim, from the fact that he says he tore it in two, eini yodea shein karam, so I know that it's torn into pieces. Umatam v'lamar karoim, so why does it say that it's torn into pieces? Melamich and kruim liolim. So it teaches us that it's torn forever, and that's what we apply over here as well. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Echad Shomeya, whether one hears this name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, V'echad Shomeya mipi Shomeya, or even if a person hears it from somebody who heard, Chayiv Lekroa, he's obligated to tear. But V'ho'edim, but in this situation where they're repeating the curse of the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, these witnesses, they heard it and now they're repeating it, Ein Chayav and Lekroa, they don't have to tear again, Shekvar Karu B'shah Shashamu, because they already tore at the time that they heard it the first time. But the Gemara continues, V'chikaru b'shah shashamu may have it, but just because they tore it at the time that they heard it the first time, what difference does that make? Hakashami hashta, but they're hearing it again right now. And the Gemara says, Lo sakadaitach, don't think that, because it's written in the Pasuk, Vayikashmo hamelech Chizkiyo, Vayikras begadav, it says when Chizkiyo heard, they told over to him what Rav Shake said, so then he tore his clothing, and we understand from that, Hamelech Chizkiyo kara, meaning King Chizkiyo, he tore. V'heim lo kara, but they didn't tear because they had already torn their clothing when they heard the first time. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, Hashomei azkara mipi ovid kochavim. If someone hears the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu from a non-Jew, eino chayiv l'kro, there's no obligation to tear clothing. V'yim tomer Rav Shakeh. Now if you're going to ask, what about Rav Shakeh? That was the situation of a non-Jew. That's not true. Yisrael mumor haya, he actually was Jewish. He was just somebody who was a mumor. He was somebody who had rebelled against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel. And Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, Ein korin ela al shem hamiyuchad bilvad. We only tear if the shem hamiyuchad is used. La'afuke kinoi delo, that comes to exclude an appellation of the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There a person does not tear. But the Gemara says, Upligi Rabbi Chia betarvayu. But Rabbi Chia, he actually argues on both of the statements we just said above. Diyam Rabbi Chia, because Rabbi Chia said, Hashomei azkara bizman hazeh. If somebody hears the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu during this time, meaning nowadays, eino chayiv l'kroa, there's no obligation to tear clothing. She'im iyata omerkin, because if you don't say that, nismali kol habeged kroim, then everybody's going to be tearing all their clothing, everyone's clothes, it's going to have to be torn all the time. And so now, what exactly did Rabbi Chia mean? Miman, who exactly is the one that's issuing this curse of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name? Ilema mi Yisrael, if you say that he heard it from a Jew, mi pekiri kuli hai, do you think Jews are, it's happening all the time? That he said, nismali kol habeged kroim, everyone's clothing is going to be torn everywhere? Jews aren't doing that. Elapshita me'ovad kochav, obviously Rabbi Chia is concerned that people are hearing it all the time from non-Jews. V'i shem hamiyuchad, now if we're talking about the shem hamiyuchad, mi gemiri, do they know the shem hamiyuchad? They're obviously using some appellation, some other name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so therefore you see, elolav b'kinoi, rather again we're talking about a kinoi, an appellation. Ushma mino, and so you see from this, bizman hazehu delo, Rabbi Chia was saying, nowadays when you hear from a non-Jew and we're talking about a kinoi, there's no need to tear. Hamei kara chai, but originally there would be an obligation, and the Gemara says, Shma mino, indeed you see that Rabbi Chia would argue on what was said from Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Hasheni Omer Afani Kamo. The second witness just says, I heard the same thing as him. He doesn't actually repeat the curse that was stated. Amr Reish Lakish says, Shma Mino, you see from this, Afani Kamo, Kasha B'dinei Mominus V'dinei Nefashis, that really the second witness to say, Afani Kamo, I say the same as him, that's actually a good way of testifying. It's kosher, both in monetary cases and in capital cases. Umalihu David Rabbanan, and it was just a stringency that we have the witnesses, each witness say over the whole thing. But over here, in the situation of cursing the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kavan Delo Efsha, since there's no other possibility, we don't want everybody to keep repeating this curse. So K'mur Rabbanan Adoraisa. So Rabbanan say you can go back to what's technically okay at a Doraisa level, and the second witness can simply say Af Ani Kamohu. Disal Gadaitach possible, because if you're going to say that on a Doraisa level, this is actually a disqualified kind of testimony. Hacha Mishum Delo Efsha Katlin on Lagavra, here because there's no other possibility, because we don't want the witness to repeat it, we would end up killing somebody. We're talking about a death penalty. That cannot be, and so therefore it must be that technically this really is considered to be good testimony. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. V'hashlishi omer afani kamo. The third witness also says afani kamo, that I heard the same thing as him. And the Gemara says to that, Stomach Rabbi Akiva, this unattributed Mishnah is following Rabbi Akiva demakish gimel l'shnayim, who compares three witnesses to two witnesses. And Rashi says Rabbi Akiva b'Meseches Makos. This is Rabbi Akiva b'Meseches Makos. Demakish shlosha l'shnayim. He compares three to two witnesses. Dim nimsa shlishi karov apostle edus shel kulan b'teilen. If we find, let's say, the third one is a relative or disqualified, then everything is batel. Hilkach bad kinan le b'hadayu. That's why we examine him together with them. The mitzvah mischachish. That way, if he's falsified or if he's contradicted, mevadlin l'sahadusayu, then we would nullify all of their testimony. That's what it's saying over here in this Mishnah as well. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Amid Beis.